Shalom, shalom, Shavua Tov. Very happy to learn with you the Sefer HaChinuch today. In the Sefer HaChinuch, we go through the 613 mitzvot, the Taryag mitzvot, in order to root them in the Torah. We go from Genesis all the way through Deuteronomy, from Bereshit through Devarim. And a reminder that the Sefer HaChinuch seems to have been written in the 13th century of Spain, and the author is anonymous. There's all different predictions about who the real author is. Some say it's Aharon Halevi from Barcelona. Some say it's a different Aharon Halevi who was a student of the Rashba. Some says it was Aharon Halevi's brother, Pinchas ben Yosef Halevi. But lots of different opinions. In any case, we've been jumping around in the Sefer, in the book, to learn the various mitzvot. And actually, it was very nice. On Shabbat, I just met a woman who said that she and a group of folks from her synagogue are actually studying this together with us. So if you have your book, feel free to open. We're going to jump to Mitzvah 25 and 26 on the topic of Mitzvah Ta'amana b'mitziut Hashem Yitbarach, that the belief in the existence of God. We'll come back to the philosophical point here about belief in just a moment. Okay, so we'll start here in the beginning, Mitzvah 25. Laha'amin sheyesh le'olam Eloha echad shehimsi kol hanimsa. Umikocho v'chefso haya kol mashu. V'shehaya v'sheyiyeh la'adei ad. V'chihu hotzianu me'eretz Yitzrayim v'natan lanu et ha-Torah. Shenemar b'tchilat netinat ha-Torah. And here's the pasuk, the verse, Anochi Adonai Elohecha asher hotzeiti me'eretz Mitzrayim. We learn here that the mitzvah is to believe that the world has one God who brought all of existence into being by God's power and by divine will, and everything comes about. All that was, all that is, and all that will be for eternal time. And that God brought us out of the land of Egypt through Yetziat Mitzrayim and gave us the Torah of Matan Torah. For it is stated at the beginning of the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Exodus 22. This is Parsha Yitro, the Torah portion of Jethro. It says, Anochi Adonai Elohecha asher hotzeiti me'eretz Mitzrayim. I am the God who brought you out. So there's this mitzvah. And we see here, just going through these various descriptions of divinity, we see here both God described as creator, redeemer, liberator, even a rewarder and a punisher. Going on in this mitzvah, we see the notion of belief in God's greatness, God's benevolence, eminence and glory, various passages around these various theological positions of what God is, which is all, of course, very complicated, and we're not going to get too much into the theology. But the first philosophical question I want to raise here is, what does it mean to count belief in God as one of the central mitzvot, the realm of belief? Now, of course, the Chinuch is based on the Rambam's Sefer HaMitzvot, and as opposed to being number 25, in the Rambam, this is Mitzvah Taseh number 1. This is the first positive command. And the Rambam says over there, the Gemara then asks the following rhetorical question: how much does the word Torah equal in the gematria? The gematria is the numerology, adding up the value, the numerical value of each letter, and making meaning of that value. To which it says the Torah's gematria is 611, adding up the value of the words. So where are the other two? 613 mitzvot, Torah only adds up to 611. He says, and the explanation is that the two commandments of I am the Lord your God, and you shall have no other God, the one we're about to see in a moment, Mitzvah 26, were heard directly from the mouth of God. Thus, it is made clear that I am the Lord is part of the count of the 613 mitzvot. So, according to the Rambam, and thus the Sefer HaChinuch, we learn that that belief in God is counted in the 613. But the Ramban, Nachmanides, disagrees with Maimonides. And first he records the view of the Baal Halachot Gedolot, known as the Bahag. And the Bahag says that belief in God is not one of the 613. Rather, it is the foundation to all the 613 commands themselves. The Ramban then gives his own view that belief in God is indeed a command, just not one of the 613 themselves, but rather foundational to all of them. Because how can you embrace a notion of divine command without embracing that there is divinity? But it's very interesting. Do you count this in the 613 or not? Big argument. But we can ask an even deeper philosophical question, which is, how can belief be commanded at all? How can emotions be commanded? Meaning the only thing that can be commanded, perhaps, is that which we are in control of. But the realm of belief or the realm of emotion, are we really fully in control? Is that really totally in our agency? And so Rav Chazdei Kreskes, in The Light of the Lord, great philosopher, writes, it will be seen from the signification and definition of the term commandment that it does not pertain except to things which involved will and choice. Consequently, if beliefs and opinions do not involve will and choice, it will follow that the signification of the term commandment will not pertain to them. So one could argue that certain ideas that are typically called mitzvot, that involve emotion or belief, may not themselves be commands. Interesting philosophical debate around what we control in our minds and our hearts and what we don't. The Biur, who is quoted by Nechama Leibovitz, the great Nechama Leibovitz of blessed memory, explains, if the text means that a person must love their fellow as themselves, it is hardly conceivable that the Almighty should command something which is beyond capacity. Moreover, feelings such as hate and love are hardly the object of commands, since they're not under human control. To fulfill such a command to the letter, a person should have to grieve for their fellow's sorrow, just as they grieve for their own. This would be intolerable, since scarcely a moment passes without hearing of some fellow Jew's misfortune. Hillel therefore correctly interpreted this passage in a negative manner. What is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. At least do nothing to your neighbor which you would not like to be done yourself. So this idea here that belief and emotions potentially can't be commanded because of what we truly can control. We go on, Rav Soloveitchik in Family Redeemed, page 40, explains this idea of belief or emotion is actually made manifest through action. It's not really just a mental or affective capacity, but rather we make manifest whether we believe, so to speak, through how we act. He writes, the Bible spoke of the commandment to love one's neighbor. However, in Talmudic literature, emphasis was placed not only upon sentiment, but upon action, which is motivated by sentiment. The Choshen Mishpat, the Jewish code of civil law, analyzes not human emotions, but actual human relations. The problem of Choshen Mishpat is not what one feels toward the other, but how we act toward them. So one might say, the question is not belief in God, but acting and in emulation of God. Halachta b'drachav, imitatio odeh. That to demonstrate belief doesn't say, oh, I'm sitting in my room and I believe, I'm saved. Right? But rather, do I live in a way that is compassionate? Do I actually live in a way that emulates the divine? Actually, interesting, a debate around Jewish virtue ethics is the issue of what does it mean to emulate God? So according to one view, I do what is good because God does it. Right? I emulate God, and I do what God does, and it's good because God does it. According to a second view, which I actually learned from my teacher, Rabbi Yitzchak Blau, is that we don't do it because God does it. To really emulate God is to do the good for the good's sake. Because God doesn't do the good to emulate God. God does the good because the good is good. So to truly emulate, we don't do the good because God does it, but we do the good because it is good. And that's the highest level of emulating God. It sounds sacrilegious when we don't want to do what God does, but actually it's more religious. We're doing it for the reason God does it, because it's good. Rabbi David Hartman of blessed memory said, what does it mean to believe in Yetziat Mitzrayim? What does it mean to believe in that we were redeemed, that we were freed from from Egypt through this Exodus. And he says, what it means to believe is not that I sit at my Pesach Seder, I sit at the Passover Seder, so I believe it, or I say the Shema every day, and I say, I believe it. But rather, whether we act just in our business dealings, whether we act justly in weights and measures, right? That the way we demonstrate a belief, so to speak, is whether we actually act as if we truly do believe that. Right? That's a fascinating way to think about this, actually, that what it means to believe in God is actually measured through action, not through belief itself. Okay, so belief in God. What does it even mean? Which God are we talking about? What dimension of God? And I think that here, thankfully, Jewish theology is very inclusive to a very wide range of views of who or what God is. I think of the Me'or V'Shemesh, his explanation that in the Amidah, in the daily prayer, we say Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Velokei Yaakov in the traditional liturgy. Elokei Sarah, Elokei Rivka, Elokei, and go on with the matriarchs for those who include matriarchs. And he says, why do we keep saying Elokei? Right, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. That rather we should say Elokei Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov. We should only say Elokei once. And the Me'or V'Shemesh, great Kabbalist, explains that we keep saying Elokei because it's really, in a sense, a different God for each of the forefathers, right? That a different relationship, a different manifestation of divinity for Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. We say each of us has a very different conceptualization of who or what God is, and a very different manifestation of divinity in our lives. And thus it's very hard to actually talk about that because we understand it differently based upon our traumas and glories and what's God's involved with and what not. And so this is something very rich and complicated, but also very beautiful. That we may believe God is in control of everything, or we may believe in a higher form of tzimtzum, that God retracted from control of the world in many ways. We may embrace a process theology or a liberation theology. We may believe in some physical manifestations of God, or perhaps in no way any physical manifestations. We can talk about what God is or does, or according to Maimonides' negative theology, we can't say anything about what God is. We may have great clarity on sort of how God operates or who God is, so to speak, or we may be quite agnostic. And that's all within the realm. If you look at Jewish traditional sources, very wide range of how we understand divinity and how divinity operates in the world. In fact, Maimonides himself explains in the Mor Nevuchim limitations on God. I know that sounds heretical, but he talks about that there's things God can't do. Like God can't multiply God's self. There's only one, and so God can't multiply God's self, or God can't destroy God's self. Things like this. So actually, there's an old joke that in my family there's a socialist and a communist and a chassid and an atheist and a nationalist, and they're all one person, right? That in fact, living with paradox and sometimes even conflicting views of what God is, that God is in control of everything, but maybe God pulled away in order to give more human free will. So to live with the paradox, we're not supposed to have perfect clarity in things that are beyond our understanding. And I think actually that because it's hard to think through all the intellectual issues all the time, that emunah, faith, is in many ways can be understood as we live in a world of darkness, and then there's these rare moments of lightning bolts in our lives where the world becomes clear, or beyond this world even becomes clear. And then we go back to the darkness. And I think faith means that when we're in the darkness, we continue to rely upon those lightning bolt moments where the world looked clear. We had a sense of how things were. We continue to reevaluate and continue to think through these issues, but we rely on that moment. By the way, if anyone ever has questions or thoughts while we're learning, please feel free to comment here, and I'd be happy to start that exchange with you. So Professor Michael Fishbane, in his book Sacred Attunement, a book I highly recommend, because very few Jews are engaged in constructive theology today, right? Explaining past theology, there's a lot of that. But constructive theology, I mean, you have people like Rabbi Dr. Art Green again, Professor Michael Fishbane, and not so many others who are actually constructing relevant theology for our time. And he explains over there in Sacred Attunement that in an era of skepticism, an era of postmodernity, that we are always unclear in the realm of belief and in the realm of action, right? And yet, even amidst that lack of clarity, we are to make imperfect choices. We may know in these imperfect choices that we may know that at a prior time or at a future time that there would be better choices made, better understandings conceived. And yet we still act in these moments, Professor Fishbane explains. Act on that belief in God and act on that clarity, even though it's not at all clear. Now, what's interesting is how easy it is to miss divinity in our lives. If you look at the Ramban, who explains, based upon the superfluous superfluous words in the verse around Moshe at the burning bush, at the sneh, it says that the angel, the malach, appeared to Moshe Rabbeinu, and then it says, and he looked at it. So if it says it appeared to him, why does it say he looked at it? And so the Ramban explains that it's superfluous because he missed it. Moshe Rabbeinu, the greatest prophet in history, the burning bush is right in front of him, and it appears to him, and he doesn't see it. He misses it. And the Ramban says, because he hadn't prepared his heart for prophecy yet. So too, I think of Heschel and his notion of radical amazement, that we should live with amazement at everything we see each day, in nature and in our lives, in our inner worlds and our outer worlds. And to just think of how much we miss on the negative side. How many people do we encounter who are at the verge of tears? And we don't see their humanity within them. We don't see their sorrow. And so too on the beauty side, how many beautiful things do we miss each day? A laughter, a flower, a sunset, something inside of ourselves. And so I think that the belief in God, while complicated, as we explored philosophically, also has a moral foundation. Part of the moral foundation is that for one who challenges the notion of there being an all-powerful God, there is the risk of saying, well, if there's no God, then the job is not taken, right? I myself can be God, right? But to embrace at least that I am not God, right? I don't know exactly who or what God is, but it's not me. It's not me. Which tangentially, we talk a lot about humans being created b'tselem Elohim, created in the image of God. So too, we know that we construct God in our own image, right? And so some Hasidic teachers actually explain that does not make our constructions false. The fact that we construct a God from our own image, we make these projections and constructions from our own Tselem Elohim, from our own image of God. And because it emerges from there, the way we construct God in our own image is in some ways limited, but true, because it emerges from our own inner godliness, which is, I think, a fascinating explanation. And yet I believe that we need to be careful. For example, using male language for God. Some are very comfortable with that. Some are very uncomfortable with that. I'm someone who's uncomfortable with that in talking about God as even when it's just an analogy, speaking of God as a male figure, or even using male language. Secondly, we know the notion of Tselem Elohim part of embracing that humans have infinite dignity and value and are unique and equal, as Rav Yitz explains those three concepts, is actually a belief that there is divinity, right? And thus there's divinity in another person that we can encounter through them. In fact, I know many people who experience God primarily through relationships, parent-child relationship, spouse relationship, the praying together, right? That relationships are needed, right? Have a minyan. To pray in a minyan is a way of saying that that we need relationships in order to access God. So we have this notion of the job of God is taken, this notion of people created in the image of God, and then of course, as we lead into Mitzvah 26, Shelo na'amin Elohut bilti Hashem levado, right? To believe that there's no other divinity but God. And here Plato explains in Greek thought that that there's a moral failing to polytheism, that when there's multiple gods, there's multiple moral authorities. And because we're not radical moral relativists, there is certainly relativity within ethics, but we're not radical moral relativists. And so the notion of monotheism, ethical monotheism, there's one God, and that's ultimately one highest moral authority. So going on here, he explains in Mitzvah 26, Shelo na'amin Elohim, Zulati Hashem levado, Shenemar, Lo hiya lecha Elohim, Acherim al panai. That we should not believe in any other God than the eternal Lord alone, as it says over here in Exodus chapter 20, verse 3, you shall have no other gods before me. It says no other gods before me. And then we go on to a very interesting passage that deals with that then there is around this prohibition of serving any other god. Then there is law for one who serves it out of love. This fake god, serving this fake god out of love, as they cherish that figure, the idol, for its great beauty. Or if one serves it out of fear that it should not harm him or someone else not harm them. But in either case, this person does not accept this other god as a god. Actually, I remember when I was in India, some kids knocked on my door and they said, these are my playing cards of my many gods. Can you show me your playing cards? I said, it's going to be a little challenge. I can show you some Rabbi cards, right? But playing cards of gods is a problem. But in any case, they say, okay, so this is a very serious issue in halakha, the worshiping of a foreign god, of idolatry, very, very serious. We're going to explore this more in our future mitzvot. But if it's not done out of a belief that that's God, but out of either some kind of love or fear, there's an argument about how that's understood differently. So if you look in Sanhedrin 60b, it's a great machlokes, Rava Abaye, and actually goes into Sanhedrin 61b also. There's a Mishnah in Sanhedrin 60b, and the Gemara, Sanhedrin 61b, is where they really explore this. So fascinating argument. Abaye says, no, Avodah Zarah, right, idolatry is an objective act. If you do the act, it's punishable according to Avodah Zarah. But Rava says something very fascinating, that actually it's subjective, that one who is engaged in idolatrous acts based upon love or fear of another person, they're not accountable for this punishment, because they're ha'oved Avodah Zarah me'ahava u'meyira, that when it's served from fear or love. And actually they look at this source of Mordechai bowing to Haman, Mordechai bowing to Haman, is used both by Rava and Abaye as a proof for their arguments ultimately, even though they come to exact opposite conclusions. So I think this is a good place to pause. Mitzvah 25 and 26, the belief in God, the belief in one God, the various roles of God as creator, as liberator, as redeemer, as rewarder, as punisher, as the all benevolent, all powerful, and the notion that there's only one God, an ethical monotheism, a foundation to Jewish thought, this philosophical debate around whether or not we can command belief at all, and this huge inclusivity of how we understand God. There's a reason that Jews don't talk much about God. Part of it's a problem, that we get too legalistic and we move away from this spirituality. But the other part is because there's an understanding that our belief is not concrete. It's very subjective and very different, and so it can be very challenging to have those kind of conversations. So we shouldn't feel alienated by God conversation. I think I would love to see this return more to the Jewish community. Kant famously said that if someone walks into the room and they're seen in a private act of prayer, that person's embarrassed. Right? We're almost embarrassed to say, I believe in God, as if it's something childish or overly simplistic. But Jewish theology teaches us it's actually incredibly complicated, incredibly rich, and a great bracha, something to wrestle with and think through, not to ever feel done in our understanding, but constantly growing and searching, that just as God is in search of man, man is in search of God. And so I want to conclude just with gratitude to my amazing mother, who has always been a loving presence in my life and has always instilled a belief and love for God throughout my life, when I was young through today, in different ways, and never imposed some belief, but merely has always reflected on her own belief, which is a beautiful way to do it. Actually, Shlomo ibn Gabriel, the Kabbalist, early Kabbalist, explains that actually you don't try, if there's two string instruments across from each other, you don't try to strum someone else's string, right? That'd be like a violent act to try to make them believe something. Rather, two string instruments across from each other, if you vibrate one of them, the one across from it will also vibrate. Beautiful idea for education and for parenting, that rather than just trying to tell someone what's true or what's right, we rather just live an inspired life and talk about it, reflect on our own beliefs, and in hope that this will also inspire others to think deeply as well. My mother should have long life and good health, and lots of blessings in all ways. Love you, Mom. Thank you all for learning. Have a great day.